Just that. Oh, you know what? That must be the Roaring Twenties. This is Professor Tatum here to guide you through yet another lecture for History 1302. Let's roll on back to the 1920s and hear them roar. This will be our first of a series of lectures in the years between the world wars. We refer to this as the interwar era. I frequently call these the bipolar years because as we're going to see, after the hardships of World War One, the nation's going to be going through a very difficult state. And then that's going to be met with this hope, which builds into an optimism, which builds into a mania, and then that mania will come crashing down into a serious depression. But we'll go ahead and start here right at the end of World War One. Look at a little context as usual. Then we'll look at some social and cultural changes going on through the 1920s, as well as some rejection to those social and cultural changes. Then we'll look at some economic changes based around this growing consumer culture throughout the 1920s, as well as seeing what direction that's going to lead the country in long term. So remember, World War One ended with the Treaty of Versailles. President Wilson tried to get his 14 points added to the treaty. Very global, progressive ideas he had there, but it was an epic failure. He was unable to get the Senate to support him because largely the country was falling apart while he was out in France playing peacemaker. We need to understand that World War One was a very traumatic war for so many people. Okay, a lot of individuals involved faced all kinds of loss. There was loss of friends on the battlefield, or loss of limbs, or loss of a sense of self after witnessing the things they witnessed and having to do some of the things they had to do to survive. And then there's, of course, loss from people back home as well who had lost loved ones in battle, or perhaps who seem to have lost a part of a friend or family member, lost connection with them, perhaps in a way, as this person's returning from war in a different kind of state. Um, People are kind of lost in a sense of understanding of why individuals, as they did before, as they did after the Civil War, are coming home and now acting a little different in certain situations, maybe responding differently to certain things, maybe getting very emotional in situations that don't make sense to anybody else to get emotional over. And again, this is all linked very much to the impacts of the trauma these individuals have faced that is not very well understood in this period. Okay, this is very closely linked to things like PTSD, which many of these young men very understandably were suffering through with their lives moving forward after World War One. A very difficult situation that the nation went through during World War One, and this would bleed into American life, into the aftermath of the war. We're going to see that this is just one of several issues that was plaguing the nation throughout 1919. Another issue plaguing not only the US, but the world in 1919 was the influenza pandemic. As soldiers were returning home from war, and as individuals were coming out into the street to celebrate the end of the war, these things contributed to a spread of this influenza pandemic, which was made even worse because there was limited knowledge on how the disease spread and prevention worked. So it wasn't so clear the crucial nature of things like quarantining, taking certain practices to protect one's health. And I'd really like to say we've learned from this, but more recent history shows that not so much. Of course, another major issue you guys have already kind of seen somewhat in your reading video quiz for this week that was plaguing the nation by the end of World War One was the first Red Scare. So remember, this is this period in U.S. history in which there's this mass fear and paranoia that there's some kind of radical foreign threat against the U.S. trying to infiltrate the U.S. and destroy it from within. This was largely driven by this Bolshevik revolution in Russia that occurred during World War One, in which these individuals who had a very radical socialist ideology led the Bolshevik revolution and installed this government here under Vladimir Lenin. People in the US began fearing that that same kind of violent overthrow of the ruling class might be spreading to other parts of the world, all right? And people were afraid that there was influence from this revolution present within the United States. Now, if you ever take History 1301 with me, you'll see that I argue that there was perhaps a first Red Scare that came a bit before this, back in the colonial period, when the Russians were getting a small foothold up in the Northwest, doing some fur trading, and that really scared them out of the Spanish, so they started colonizing a little further up north into Northern California and things like that. But this is what historians generally accept as the first Red Scare, all right? In this first Red Scare, any kind of idea that's considered to be radical or foreign starts to get lumped together into this one category of a common threat, right? People frequently use the word Bolshevism or red as a kind of blanket term to describe any kind of radical idea, things like socialism, anarchism, communism. Also, a lot of the times, the word communism is still in the 21st century kind of blanketly, it's kind of used as a blanket term to describe a lot of these different ideas or anything that seems foreign, and that's really rooted here in this Red Scare. So let's break down very quickly what each of these are to see that they are distinct. So Bolshevism has a very particular meaning. This is a political movement led by the Bolshevik Party in Russia. These are the Russian revolutionaries that established the socialist dictatorship under Vladimir Lenin in Russia. Something very specific going on there, okay? Socialism is a political and economic system, or political ideology, we could say, in which government or community control key industries and try to reduce inequality. Okay, so there's some distribution of wealth, yet there is still some private property ownership. This is frequently used or seen as a gateway to communism. Not all socialist states are aiming toward communism, though. Some are just fine with being socialist states and they're good with that. But in many cases, they are aiming to reach a state of communism. And just to be clear, that a lot of what gets called communism is actually just very radical elements of socialism. True communism has never truly existed at the national level. There are perhaps small episodes of it occurring at a communal level among individuals at a small scale, but there's never been a feasible way to make this work at the national level. All right, so communism, to clear up, is not this what a lot of people think it is. Okay, a lot of people associate communism with meaning very strong, powerful government dictating what everybody does, saying you must do this, you must do that, and trying their best to, in theory, make sure that things are being distributed equally. But in the process, they get so powerful that the whole system kind of loses its purpose. That's really more an extreme level of socialism, like what we saw in the Soviet Union. Communism is this kind of utopian state. It's this political ideology where all property is collectively owned by the community, by the people. All right, people communally own all means of production. All right, there's no private property, and all people see each other on an equal level. All right, there's no class distinction. So this is really a stateless society where there's no need for government because people are communally taking care of things for themselves. All right, the people are essentially agreeing upon living in a communal manner. So that's quite a bit different than socialism, where there is a strong state implementing all these things and kind of trying to push people to be equitable and distributing all the wealth and telling people what they need to do, right? Anarchism, also a bit different than these others. This is simply a political philosophy that advocates self managed societies, all right? Again, meaning no government, no need for government. This is very much a rejection of any form of authority in people's lives. This is allowing people to make decisions for themselves and to govern themselves. Now, this can get very communal and blend into what's called anarcho communism, where people are collectively making decisions, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. It's simply a rejection of government and a rejection of authority. So these are all clearly distinct ideas, all right? They're all different. But again, they all tended to start to get paired together during this first Red Scare. And I would argue a lot of this still blends into the present day. All right, we kind of gotten over using that term Bolshevism, but you'll still hear people quite frequently misuse terms like socialism or communism to accuse anyone of anything they don't like of being that, right? If somebody has a different radical idea, they must be a socialist. But this has also gone the opposite way as well in the 21st century. People on the left, if there's something they don't like, they just call it fascist. I'd say this is all somewhat of a product of this first Red Scare. Now, while the first Red Scare got totally blown out of proportion and people started fearing something that they really didn't have much of a reason to fear, there was a link of this to something that was very real. Okay, so there was a legitimate threat of some radical anarchists in the US during the same time period that was getting tied into all of this. Okay, so this radical anarchist threat was led primarily by Italian and American radicals, not Russians. And these individuals were doing things like mailing bombs around the country, setting bombs off. They were trying to assassinate very wealthy individuals, powerful individuals, businessmen, politicians. So, for example, the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, there was an anarchist who tried to bomb his home and he ended up blowing himself up. All right. And this all culminated in this very deadly bombing on Wall Street that resulted in somewhere around 40 deaths. So there's a legitimate threat here that people can perhaps be fearful of. But again, this is all kind of getting lumped into things it doesn't really fit with. All right. This is considered part of this big Bolshevik threat. This is evidence people suggest that the ideas that backed the Bolshevik Revolution have now infiltrated the United States and are spreading here, when really this is something completely different. This is Italians and Americans with their own separate radical ideas happening to take very radical actions around the same time that this Bolshevik Revolution had played out. All right, but this still added to that paranoia of the Red Scare. Another issue going on between World War One up into the early 1920s was a series of severe labor strikes that frequently broke out into riots, especially when businesses would hire goons to try to go beat up striking workers. There's also frequently clashes with police and strikers, so these could get very violent. A good example of this we can see is the Boston police strike of 1919. So here, it's exactly what it sounds like. Some police officers in Boston wanted better working conditions and wanted better pay, and they were not seeing that happen. So they collectively refused to go to work to try to demand these things. And as you might imagine, if there's a widely publicized walkout of police refusing to do their job, a lot of people are going to take advantage of that. And that's exactly what happened here in Boston. And there was a total breakdown of law and order, and the National Guard had to be called in to shut down all the chaos. And pretty quickly, the city of Boston had to replace all these striking officers. And people started to argue, look, this is clear evidence that there is some kind of threat trying to break down our law and order. They have put these officers up to strike. All right. A lot of these striking officers were referred to, for example, as agents of linen. Well, there is no evidence whatsoever that these were anything more than individuals wanting to get decent pay and better working conditions. But labor unions, we also need to understand, didn't have these ideas of collectivism and workers collectively struggling to improve their conditions. And those were very much ideas that were prevalent throughout the Bolshevik Revolution and throughout the Soviet Union that emerged as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. So people started making connections to say these must be the same kinds of communists trying to take over our country now because they've been infiltrated by the idea of the Bolsheviks and the Reds. We do need to understand that some of these labor unions who were prevalent, starting even in the Gilded Age, did advocate ideas of socialism, but there was no clear link there between their ideas of socialism and the Bolshevism that drove the Russian Revolution. They were just simply individuals who had ideas of collectivism and having a state that tried to provide equitable support, for example, to workers. But the majority of labor unions were not even tied into these more radical ideas. So a lot of them were just simply pushing for things like improved working conditions and better pay, yet they started to get viewed as this common socialist threat and part of this bigger Red Scare. There was also extensive racial and political violence throughout 1919. The summer of 1919 was referred to as Red Summer, where there was a lot of lynchings, race riots, attacks on Black communities and Black veterans. And in response to this mass paranoia, and very much in response to the attempted bombing of Attorney General Palmer's home, Attorney General Palmer began a series of raids against suspected radicals, referred to as Palmer raids. You guys saw that these primarily targeted immigrant communities and labor unions very indiscriminately, would just kind of round people up. And many of them were targeted with little to no evidence of them being guilty of anything whatsoever. They were just suspected radicals, so that's enough reason to haul them in. And this led to thousands of U.S. citizens as well as immigrants being arrested and detained without going through that proper due process of law that's supposed to be guaranteed to all people within the United States, regardless of whether or not you're a citizen. This also demonstrated the extent of the first Red Scare. Gee, led to, demonstrated. Those sure sound like important words that link to something that we may need to write about for an exam, no? Make sure you know those. Then there was the Black Sox scandal, where members of the Chicago White Sox intentionally lost the game in the World Series because they had made some bets ahead of time and made some agreements with some gamblers. There's been some suggestion that this was all kind of orchestrated by the coach, but then there's been others who have suggested evidence shows no, this was more the players wanting to do this for themselves. But it's pretty widely accepted regardless is that there was a strong organized crime connection here, and that a Jewish crime kingpin named Arnold Rothstein had a pretty heavy involvement and encouraging all this to play out the way that it did. All right. So very clearly an example of extreme corruption here. Okay, this just kind of demonstrates, in addition to all the other chaos we're seeing in 1919, a kind of breakdown in order in American society, right? Even something as simple as entertainment is full of darkness and corruption and malaise in this year of 1919. So as the country's falling apart, as there's bombs going off and people being rounded up and arrested unjustly, and racial violence, political violence, labor disputes, American baseball players rigging the World Series, where is President Wilson? He is the chief executive. He should be there executing the law, restoring law and order to the nation, no? Providing a sense of calm for all the American citizens, letting them know it's going to be okay. But remember, Wilson's busy over in France playing peacemaker. With all this in perspective, this may help you understand a little more why the Senate was so hesitant to sign onto the Treaty of Versailles. Again, I've suggested there are other reasons, but this is a major reason that frequently gets underplayed. So by the end of World War I in 1919, after suffering through all these difficulties, several people throughout the United States were looking for anything new that might bring them a sense of hope, a sense of overcoming the hardships of both World War I and 1919. And people started clinging to and pushing for and creating all kinds of changes within American society. And this is what's going to give birth to that big boom, that big roar of the 1920s. So let's look at some of those changes that began playing out as a result of trying to overcome these hardships. So some were definitely in response to prohibition. So prohibition, we need to remember, refers to the prohibition of the sale, manufacturing, and transportation of alcohol in response to the 18th Amendment, also enforced by a law known as the Volstead Act. But we need to remember that most Americans did not take this very seriously. Many people continued to consume alcohol in different ways. All right, so there was definitely nightclubs, speakeasies booming throughout the 1920s. Speakeasies, by the way, were bars that operated illegally despite prohibition being in effect. Their name is kind of based around this lore that people had to speak real easy. They had to whisper a password to the doorman to be able to get inside because it's a secret, illegally operating bar. But I would suggest that's a lot more tied to legend and lore, because really, what we know about speakeasies, there was cops and politicians and lawyers and everybody else frequenting these establishments and drinking right alongside everybody else. So most likely it wasn't much of a secret. I really doubt you actually had to whisper a password to get into most of these. But you might be wondering, okay, where are these speakeasies getting their alcohol from? If it's illegal to sell it, transport it, manufacture it, well, a lot of people, when they knew this law was going into effect, started stocking up because there was no law against simply possessing or consuming alcohol, right? But there's no way they could have stocked up enough to last them all the way through Prohibition. Prohibition was going to last indefinitely. Nobody knew if or when this thing would come to an end. So there's no way that everybody could have stocked up enough to last for God knows when. So there were other ways that people got alcohol around the country. All right. Some people did begin to distill liquor to make moonshine. All right. A lot of homemade beer, homemade wine, homemade spirits, a lot of things like bathtub gin, white lightning, Mountain Dew being made out in the countryside. But this was actually pretty limited. But the bigger scale operations that were really bringing alcohol throughout the country was through bootlegging from places like Canada and Cuba and Mexico. There were individuals referred to as bootleggers and run runners and beer runners who would bring in alcohol from these areas, and they would create kind of transportation networks by boat and by truck to smuggle alcohol into the country, and then they'd have routes to smuggle it throughout the country under the guise of transporting some other kind of food or some other kind of product. And these bootlegging operations were frequently led by organized crime kingpins, such as Al Capone, the boss of the Chicago outfit, very popular, well known bootlegger of the 1920s. And the operations that these bootleggers formed became very organized. Right, we already saw some small scale development of organized crime during the Gilded Age. I'd say it went a step further here in the 1920s, as these individuals began getting involved with extensive networks of bribery, and trying to spread political influence so that they could have protection of their rackets, especially those related to prohibition. And they also capitalized on things like speakeasies, trucking that they needed in order to transport their goods from place to place. That helped them kind of start branching out into all other kinds of ventures. But there were a lot of gangs competing for control of these illegal alcohol sales in certain areas. And that led to a lot of violence and gang warfare within the streets of American cities. Okay, there were all kinds of shootouts. It was in this era that there were some uses of Tommy guns among members of organized crime. Al Capone, for example, one day while sitting at a restaurant in the Hawthorne Hotel, where there was a lot of glass windows in the front of the restaurant, was shot at by some individuals who did a drive-by shooting with some Tommy guns, shattered all the glass. From the story I've heard and read about, the poor little girl who was there at the restaurant wound up getting blinded. There are rumors that Al Capone felt so bad about that he ended up paying for some kind of eye surgery for her. Not sure if that's true or not. But we do know that this also resulted in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So this was the slaying of several individuals of the Irish North Side Gang in Chicago who had been in competition with Al Capone to control illegal alcohol sales in the city. It's widely believed that some of Al Capone's henchmen set up a situation where they lured these guys into this garage, making them think that there was a shipment of illegal alcohol there, that they were going to sell them for a good price. But then these individuals were met by two men in police uniforms who were believed to have been Al Capone's henchmen, but they lined these men up against the wall, telling them they were under arrest. And then at that point, other individuals in plain clothes came in. And then those two men dressed as policemen, as well as two individuals in plain clothes, gunned all these guys down with Tommy guns and shotguns. Then the two men dressed in police uniforms escorted out the two men in plain clothes to a police car and hauled them off as if they were being arrested, and as if the gunshots that anybody may have heard was something going on with those individuals who the police had already arrested, so there was no need to be concerned. The cops had already taken care of it. But one thing I always like to point out here is one of these individuals among those who were slain was not actually even a gangster. He just hung around a lot. He thought they were cool. He got a kick out of it. So let that be a lesson to you guys about hanging out with sketchy people and putting yourself in sketchy situations. You never know how that's going to turn out for you. Right? That sounds so cliche and cheesy, but for this guy here, with his blood and brains splattered all over the floor, I promise you it wasn't a joke. Okay. There was also one individual said to have survived this attack, who the police tried to question as he was dying, and he continuously just said, "Nobody shot me. Nobody shot me," holding up his gangster code to his very last moment. This is a very devastating attack, okay, and it was very widely believed to have been orchestrated by Al Capone. It's believed the intended target was George Bugs Moran, the leader at this time of the North Side Irish Gang. Um, but Bugs Moran, on his way to this meeting, was a little late, and on his way in, he saw either the men in police uniforms or a police car parked outside. Something kind of set his alarm off to, I probably shouldn't actually go to this meeting after all. And he went down the street and had a cup of coffee, and sure enough, that saved his life. All right, but all this violence here, all this mayhem, and the intended target wasn't even killed. And while it's widely accepted that Al Capone orchestrated this murder, and forensic experts years down the road were even able to identify at least one of the bullets found here at the scene was from a gun that belonged to Al Capone's lieutenant, Machine Gun Jack McGurn. So it's pretty clear he orchestrated this murder. He was never charged with this. And for that matter, nobody was ever convicted of this mass slaying here. Violent episodes like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre demonstrated, on one hand, the clear criminal element that was backing the illegal alcohol sales as a result of prohibition. But this also led to increased public opposition toward prohibition, okay, as people began to recognize, well, we all want to continue to drink. That's kind of a popular American pastime. But as long as we have to do so illegally, the money we're spending on alcohol was going to be supporting this, right? So people began calling on politicians to bring prohibition to an end so that they could rather pay legitimate establishments for their alcohol instead of having to sponsor things like this. Other social and cultural changes going on in the 1920s surrounded women. There was a boom in a type of woman referred to as a flapper. Flappers were carefree young women in the 1920s who defied traditional gender norms, engaged in things like drinking, smoking, dancing. Look, you can see these women here are wearing dresses above their ankles. And these ladies here, they're really pushing their luck, wearing their skirts above their knees. Can you believe it? They had bobbed short hair, slightly tighter clothes. Look at all that makeup they're wearing. This would have all been considered very risque by the standards of the 1920s. Okay, but this is these women demonstrating a sense of liberation, showing that they don't have to live up to these ridiculous standards. Okay, that they can form their own sense of identity. They can dress how they want to. They can drink if they want to. They can dance if they want to. They can stay out late if they want to because they have their own sense of self. And this was considered very radical for this era. As you guys saw, there was also changing ideas about women's health and sexuality beginning to develop in the 1920s. Margaret Sanger, for example, founded the American Birth Control League, which would eventually become Planned Parenthood. This started as an illegal operation that she had to do kind of secretly, and then eventually gained public notoriety and was able to operate publicly. And the reason Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood is because she wanted to provide women not only access to contraceptives for very valid reasons, she also wanted women to have more accurate and truthful information about their bodies. Okay. Women were fed all kinds of bullshit in this period about, and she just wanted women to really understand who they were and what they needed to do to provide the best care for themselves. Furthermore, during her time as a nurse, she realized that as contraceptives did start becoming available, it was more the middle class and wealthy women who had access to them, while poorer women did not. And in many cases, even married women who were living with their husbands, if they wound up accidentally pregnant, doctors would tell them things like, oh, well, maybe you shouldn't be looking so good around your husband. All right. Maybe you need to dress down a little bit so that he doesn't get so worked up. Right. What kind of excuse is that? Telling a married couple they can't enjoy each other's company? But Margaret Sanger saw that there'd be women who would have more children than they could quite literally afford to feed. All right. We need to understand this is a time before there were any type of government benefits for people in those kinds of situations. And that was quite literally, if you couldn't afford to feed your kids, you could not afford to feed your kids. And that was that. So there were women having more kids than they wanted to. In many cases, it wasn't necessarily because they were trying. You know, these things gonna happen if you're in a long-term relationship with somebody and there is a level of sexual attraction there, right? And Margaret Sanger very unfortunately saw some very difficult episodes where there were people not only living in poverty, but there were women who tried to take advices from very sketchy quote unquote doctors who would try to talk them through how to give themselves abortions or would try to perform very unsafe abortions. This led to very serious injuries, long term illnesses, and even deaths of many women very brutally that Margaret Sanger herself witnessed throughout her life. It's not that she was a baby killer trying to end lives and be a big sinner. She was trying to protect the lives, the safety, and the health of other women. The 19th Amendment, which of course granted national women's suffrage, we saw this as something a lot of progressives had pushed for, was fully passed, ratified in 1920, and women officially gained that right to vote. Again, this is a very big cultural change, empowering women in a way that they had been disempowered in previous generations. There was also a big boom in African American culture throughout the 1920s through a phenomenon known as the Harlem Renaissance. This was a big boom in African American art and culture that involved things like expressions of cultural pride. There's a lot of jazz music and other forms of music through which African Americans would express themselves. There's also a lot of other art, things like paintings, drawing, poetry that were very prominent throughout this Harlem Renaissance. This was called the Harlem Renaissance because it really was centered in Harlem. Harlem was kind of the big hot spot where all this was booming and happening. But this was really something that was spreading throughout the country as well. And African Americans in various communities throughout the country were going through these same big waves of cultural expression. And as part of this Harlem Renaissance, there was a movement called the New Negro Movement. This is where and individuals started using that boom of the Harlem Renaissance, okay, using things like poetry and music and literature and art, expressing the woes they faced during the Jim Crow era, and also pushing for Black uplift, all right, calling on Black individuals to empower themselves and to take pride in their culture so that they could overcome some of their social and political hardships. I do want to very quickly, since I brought up this word here, address this term Negro. Um, Please don't go writing an ugly anonymous review, as one student did once at the end of the semester, saying how racist I am for using the N word in class. That is not the N word, okay? This is somewhat of a dated term we don't really use in the 21st century. But this term is not really derogatory in its nature the way that the actual N word is. This is a term that was frequently used in this period by even African Americans themselves to express who they were. And when we're looking at this word in historical studies, especially in this context here of people using this word as a term of pride to express their culture, it is perfectly fine to use that word. Okay. Again, not one we really use in the 21st century, but in studies of history, there's nothing derogatory about it unless you're using it in a derogatory manner, which I think is pretty clear I'm not doing here. So, again, please, no ugly reviews about how racist I am for using the N word. No. But as there were all these big social and cultural booms throughout the 1920s, there was also a lot of pushback to this. Clear example we can see of that is with the Scopes trial. So this was a trial in which a teacher named John Scopes was trying to teach Charles Darwin's principles of evolution in his classroom. Okay, so there's some social and cultural changes. There's people starting to grasp onto science and scientific studies and teach these new scientific studies to their students in the classroom.
But the problem that Scopes faced was that there was a law that prevented teachers from teaching Darwinism and particularly the theory of evolution in public education. And John Scopes argued that this law should be overturned so that teachers could teach this theory, which had a scientific backing.
And that was challenged by none other than William Jennings Bryan. Remember, we'd seen him run as a candidate for the Populist Party before. That kind of was the decline of the Gilded Age domestically when he lost that election. He was representing some fundamentalist Christians. Their argument was that the teaching of evolution defied the creation story of Judeo Christian scripture. All right. So, according to the Bible and the Torah before it, in the book of Genesis, God created the world in 6 days. So they're saying, how could there possibly have been this course of evolution that played out over this long span of time if the world was created in only 6 days? All right. So by suggesting these things, you are being sinful and you're spreading sin to the children of our nation. And this really turned into a big debate between more modernist Americans who were pushing for new kinds of ideals and traditionalists who were rejecting a lot of these changes coming about. All right. And this really turned into this widely publicized debate back and forth between these guys, more than anything, over how we could perhaps fit religion into the modern world. Okay. So, for example, one argument made was okay, so if God is, according to Christianity, this eternal, infinite being, couldn't it be that a day to God is a much larger span of time than a simple 24 hours that a human being understands a day to be? Okay, so by those standards, could we not agree that 6 days to God could equate to a much larger span of time than what we would consider to be 6 days? So within that span of time, could this evolution not have perhaps played out? And there was a lot of back and forth like that between these guys. And eventually, it did end up getting to the point where the trial had to come to a close.
And the court ultimately wound up ruling against John Scopes. They decided to not overturn the law. They kept the law on the books saying that teachers could not teach evolution in these public classes, and therefore John Scopes was convicted of violating this law.
This is a clear example of people pushing back to some of these social and cultural changes occurring throughout the 1920s. Another example we can see of pushback to these social and cultural changes was through the emergence of a second Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s. The first Klan had largely been shut down by the end of Reconstruction, but they were back with full resurgence by the 1920s, heavily influenced by that film, The Birth of a Nation, we talked about before. This new Klan was active in the South, but they were actually centered in the northern Midwest, okay, in states like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. And this new Klan had a much more extensive target base, all right? They weren't simply targeting African Americans and their allies as they had been during Reconstruction. They were now targeting anybody pretty much who didn't fit the mold of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. They were targeting Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and in many cases, they were even targeting individuals who were embracing some of these social and cultural changes of the 1920s. Things like the alcohol, the nightlife, the changing gender norms. All of these things were seen as threats by this new Klan. And there's what seems to be a great book about this. I still haven't read it yet. I have been having it sitting on my shelf for God knows how long, but I've been caught up with this and that. But I've seen some book talks and things on it, and it seems like a very fascinating book by an author named Timothy Egan that looks into this second Klan. So if you're interested, go check that out. It's been recommended to me by multiple colleagues. Go check it out. So this second Ku Klux Klan operated pretty publicly. They portrayed themselves as a good, wholesome American organization. And they acted as a kind of fraternal group, something maybe like Boy Scouts. And they would try to get the whole family involved with this in different ways. They would particularly try to appeal to younger white children. So we can see here, for example, here's an ad for a Klan day at the fair here in Texas. Go out to the fair in Dallas, Texas, and hang out with your local Klansman. Maybe he'll paint your face for you. But as they're operating in like this Boy Scouts type organization, saying that they're just advocating good old traditional American family values and Christian values, in secret, they're still carrying out mass violence, carrying out lynchings, doing the kinds of things we associate with the Ku Klux Klan. All right, so we clearly see some social and cultural changes, as well as some pushback to those changes occurring throughout the 1920s. As I suggested, there was also some big economic changes throughout the 1920s, help feeding into this boom, this roar of the 1920s, this sense of excitement that people were seeking after the hardships of World War I in 1919. So we need to keep in mind, throughout World War I, people were having to ration, right? They were having to cut back on certain products and having to limit themselves in terms of what they were consuming. Well, this led to a sense of desire for mass luxury throughout the 1920s. People were ready to consume it up now since they'd had to hold back during the war. Now, we need to keep in mind that these economic changes and these big booming consumerism that is largely associated with the 1920s was not possible for all Americans, okay? So, especially people in the poorest rural areas were not able to indulge in this consumerism the way that people in the urban cities were, all right? But this was made possible for a lot of Americans by several economic changes that were occurring throughout the 1920s. So, for example, Henry Ford had advanced his assembly line to increase productivity to a great extent, making more products more available more cheaply for more consumers. This was extensive mass production here, kind of like we'd seen during the Gilded Age, but taken off again to a much larger scale. So one thing that really became available for cheap in this period was the automobile made by Henry Ford. And Henry Ford has this famous quote that you could get his Model T car, which is the first car widely marketable to the public, in any color you wanted as long as it was black. The point he's getting at there is he's not trying to make this nice, fancy, customizable car. He's trying to make something that can be mass produced very quickly and made available for a fair price to as many consumers as possible. Right, making more products available to more people. There were also all kinds of new inventions that were in some cases time saving, in other cases adding to entertainment and leisure. So things like household appliances like refrigerators, blenders, vacuum cleaners. We probably think of these things in the 21st century as perhaps dated and not that helpful. But imagine for the first time being a woman who's expected to stay at home all day, caring for your home and caring for your kids, and suddenly you don't have to spend all day sweeping the floor. You can speed up the process with a vacuum cleaner, okay? Or if the kids come home from school and they're hungry, you don't have to make a whole meal. You can blend them up a little something to hold them over as you cook dinner. That's going to really change life for a lot of people, and create more time for things like leisure, which was being made available through inventions like the radio. Right? So remember, we talked about during the Gilded Age, people having access to music in their homes for the first time. Well, now there's this live transmitted radio where people can listen to things like baseball games or even listen to the same programs hosted by the same DJ for the first time. And this, we need to understand, created a shared consumer experience where now all of a sudden people can say, "Hey, did you catch that ball game on the radio last night? Or did you hear what that man on the radio said between these songs yesterday? Or have you heard this hit new song by such and such artist?" This is creating something that people can unite over in a new way, all right? All made possible by the economic changes of the 1920s. Something else that was pushing this big boom in consumer culture was planned obsolescence. So this refers to creating products that will intentionally eventually become obsolete and need to be replaced by some other kind of product later down the road. So this would involve saying things like advertisements, kind of showing off certain goods being appropriate for certain seasons. So advertising here to these women, come get this nice dress this season. This is the dress of the month. But next month, you don't want to get caught dead in this dress because that's dated. You want the new dress of the month, all right? Or maybe they'll have a nice summer dress, but then by winter, oh, you don't want to be wearing that old summer dress. You need this nice fur coat. This also had to do with creating new and advanced models of things. Okay, so moving on beyond Henry Ford's basic black Model T car. Well, who wants to be driving that old thing if you can be driving a nice fancy blue automobile? Don't you want a little blue on your jalopy? Well, come on over here and buy our car. But oh, in a couple years, you don't need that anymore because now we've added in advanced steering to this thing. So you want to sell that old junk heap and buy this new one, right? This also involved things like creating technology that would intentionally break down or wear down over time so that people would have to go pay to get new items, or maybe go pay to try to get it repaired. And while they're there trying to get it repaired, some salesman can come up and sell them something else. Again, this is something we very clearly see in the 21st century, right? You can maybe go in saying, "Hey, I'd like to get my washer repaired." And then while you're there, you have somebody start telling you about some great credit plan that you could use to buy the new top of the line washer and dryer for a good discount, and you're only paying it off for the rest of your life, and blah, 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 blah. And you're just like, dude, I just want to get my washer fixed. It shouldn't have broken in the first place. But it was intentionally designed to break so you would wind up in that situation and be willing to spend more money. That, my friends, is planned obsolescence in a nutshell. Another big economic change throughout the 1920s that contributed to this boom in consumer culture was the increased use of credit. So, not really credit cards at this point, but a lot of stores started offering credit plans, installment buying, where people could put down a little money now, take home the product they wanted, and then pay it off over time. And this really made a lot of goods more accessible to more people. Okay, so maybe somebody can't afford to put down the extensive price tag that's on the Model T here, but they can pay enough to drive it home today and continue to make payments on it moving forward. You can't not be without a Model T if your neighbor has one. So why don't you just put down what you got? We'll take care of you moving forward. Excuse me, with high interest rates. Ignore that last part. And as you might imagine, this became very, very harmful long term. Okay, people started getting in over their heads. While for the first time, a lot of people were having access to that opportunity to pay now, pay a little bit now, take it home now, and then have to pay more later. Things like interest payments really started catching up with a lot of Americans, and a lot of people found themselves in tremendous debt as a result of this. Okay, and unfortunately, a lot of people did get very carried away with the hysteria of the roar of the 1920s and gave into this consumerism, buying all kinds of stuff they couldn't afford to pay off in the long term. And that led to a massive crash in the economy that would have all kinds of other ramifications for people living through that depression as well. And that's what we'll be looking at in our next lecture. Check in with you then. If you have any questions here, let me know. Otherwise, over and out.